Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. Austin Police Chief Brian Manley confirmed that the Texas Department of Public Safety is currently reviewing how the Austin Police Department processes and clears sexual assault cases. Run by DPS's Uniform Crime Reporting Program, the audit intends to ensure APD is acting in accordance with federal guidelines. For context on what's going on here, last month, reporters with Newsy, Reveal, and ProPublica, together with PRX, together formed, also with a former sergeant with APD's Sex Crimes Unit, uncovered that Austin Police Department had allegedly and knowingly miscategorized as many as 1,400 rape cases as having been exceptionally cleared, when in fact no charges had been filed and no arrests had been made. And in many cases, the survivors had not themselves been informed of the verdict or that anyone had even been processed for that. Can we expect DPS to shed light on Austin's apparently rogue police force, or is this another case of the fox guarding the henhouse? To talk about all this and more is Amanda Lewis, a social worker and community organizer with the Survivor Justice Project. Thank you, Amanda, for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, very
intro.
Thank you. Very glad to have you on. So can you give us a little bit of sort of your background as you've been, as the Survivor Justice Project has been working on police accountability? What led up to this kind of moment of revelation?
Sure. So Survivor Justice Project, we formed as a coalition of survivors and advocates to look at system issues for survivors. We formed in 2016 around the backlog of rape kits here in Austin. And what we soon realized in conversations with longtime professionals in the sexual assault field and survivors was that, you know, the backlog was really a symptom of a much deeper issue and a lack of attention and commitment to addressing violence, sexual violence and gender-based violence in Austin. And that created a series of incidences in the city. So it was the backlog, and then there were issues with the kids. There were, statements made by elected officials that contradicted what a lot of survivors would believe to be the case, that they would report and that someone would investigate thoroughly and that they would eventually get to prosecution. And so with all that in mind, we've been seeing kind of this trend, and it's so important that, this case cleared report that came out is seen as kind of a continuation of just a lack of interest and commitment to addressing harm for women in Austin. And so, I think that's the main thing, is that we see this as a much bigger, one piece of a much bigger pie. And I think that it leads us to this need to not just fix one thing. Okay, this case clearance rate report comes out, or this article or investigation comes out, and we deal with that on its own, but we really have to look at it in the big picture of it and dig a lot deeper than just this one instance, because it's been going on for years.
Yeah, I think every time something comes up involving Austin Police Department and their sex crimes unit or otherwise investigations into sex crimes, it seems like they lurch from scandal to scandal as they do this. So first, there was obviously the issue that many people here will know of the, as you were mentioning, the rape kit backlog, that essentially so many of these rape kits were unprocessed for so long. And then from my understanding, by the time they were processed, many of them had grown mold. Many of them supposedly were unusable. That was kind of the general information that was coming out to us. And so then Austin then goes through, APD goes through all these rape kit backlogs, and then we get to our next scandal, which is essentially that 1,400 of these were miscategorized as having been exceptionally cleared. That is to say, according to Austin Police Department, that they knew who it was who perpetrated the rape or the sexual assault. that they had an address, they knew that where this person was, but that according to Austin Police Department, there was something preventing them from prosecuting, from making the arrest and prosecuting. And as Newsy, ProPublica, as the journalists working on this this essentially nationwide story that broke, as they revealed, many of the survivors did not even know that their case had been processed. So this contradicts in many ways what Police Chief Brian Manley was saying, that so many of these survivors did not want to move forward with prosecution. Can you maybe speak to any of the background that a Survivor Justice Project has worked on? Do you think that's again, I know we've covered this. I know this is not kind of the update, but do you think that's a likely claim that most of these survivors don't want to go forward, or is this more kind of cover up by APD?
I think it's definitely cover. I think it's spin, because advocates, survivors, folks that have been paying attention for a long time, that's not what we've seen. I did hospital accompaniment. I was at a crisis center as a social worker. And, a lot of survivors make that decision whether or not they want to go through this process when they decide to report. And in the state of Texas, that's only about 9% of survivors. So we're looking at, a smaller subset of actual survivors that are choosing to go through with this very invasive process. And I think what's disturbing about Chief Manley's comments is that he doesn't seem to be as concerned as he should be. He's not being as respectful about how important that is, and then just to blame survivors when it's probably a lot deeper than that. I think what's really going on, and I think this is why we need a deep dive, is what we believe is going on is that these cases should actually be suspended for some reason. I think there's a lot of folks in our community that believe that they might not actually have probable cause, but they're wanting to make their numbers look better. We also think that even if the cases that survivors are not wanting to move forward, I think that needs to be picked apart and contextualized a lot more. Like, why are they not wanting to move forward? Are they being persuaded to leave the process? Are they not being helped through the process? Do they not have enough support? That there's a lot of unanswered questions, but I think for sure Chief Manley taking that line that, it's survivors that are not moving forward and we want to be respectful. I think that we have to be really critical of that, because that doesn't, as I said, echo what survivors and advocates have been saying.
So then let's move to the DPS part of this. That's the Texas Department of Public Safety. It seems to me that for Austin Police Department to be handing this over to DPS is actually almost a downgrade in accountability from an already unaccountable police department. How do you feel that moving this over to DPS for this quote unquote audit, how do you feel that will affect either the likelihood of anyone getting justice or the accountability of Austin Police moving forward?
Well, I think that what's important to understand is Chief Manley is saying, hey, we're going to have DPS, Department of Public Safety, check our work on this. He's not saying that there's, this is interesting and disturbing information, let's dig deeper. No, he's saying we want someone to tell us that we're right about this. And then the time period is just so short. He's looking at 3 months in 2017, which is not going to give you a good picture of the extent of the issue, right? So it's not a real, I don't see this as a legitimate audit. And DPS also, they have a very close relationship. DPS is now in charge of APD's crime lab. So they're connected in ways that we think that that's not, they can't be, impartial. And, they're not experts in sexual assault. The person that would need to do a real thorough audit would have to be folks that are really, really well informed in that area. So I think there's a couple of really, really important things to understand about why DPS isn't the right fit. But also, can you really do a thorough audit in less than a week? They literally, when they first announced, they said it was going to take a day or two or three. We haven't gotten any reports back. We don't know if that's going to be reported to the public. But, I mean, just the idea that you can do a thorough, legitimate report in a couple of days, I think, should cast a lot of doubt on it. The truthfulness or the honesty or the thoroughness of any report from DPS on this.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking about a scandal that encompasses many years of the Austin sex crimes unit. I believe this goes back to, I'm forgetting the year offhand, but I want to say it goes back to about 2012 or so, covering 1,400 rape cases, a little over 1,400 rape cases that were, quote unquote, exceptionally cleared. And so this audit is being done not on the entire, first of all, it's, again, just so people understand, the audit being done on the Austin rape cases, this nationwide scandal that has broken. The audit is being done by DPS, yet another just police force that we don't have any reason to trust. It does not have the kind of expertise to do this, even if they were otherwise a trustworthy source on this. And I'd love to go over why DPS is not a trustworthy source in a bit. But then they're not only are essentially they handing over the again, to use a metaphor, they're handing over the henhouse to yet another fox, but they are also essentially wanting the DPS to solve this or to audit this, or essentially to tell them they're doing okay by covering just you said a few months worth of cases, and their entire audit is expected to take place in a few days. I mean, I don't see where anything at all can get done there. I think, this is, it's laughable to me.
Yeah, I think it's laughable and it's insulting, honestly. And I think it's really unfortunate because I think there was a really great opportunity to just come out and say, wow, this is difficult information. This is really hard. Let's take our time and really try to understand and look into this. I think that would have been a great response, right? Because Chief Manley, who's a newer chief here, I mean, he's been in Austin, of course, many, many years. But this could have been an opportunity to really kind of take a look and start new and fresh with this issue. But that wasn't the tactic. And honestly, I know why, just knowing the work that we've done and the folks that we've talked to. This is a really hard topic, and it's one that a lot of places aren't getting right, as you can tell by that news investigation. So this is difficult, but this is an opportunity, and I think there are leaders in Austin that see this as an opportunity to right this kind of whole history of issues around sexual assault investigations and prosecutions in Austin. So that's one reason to be positive, but I think what's negative is we're still kind of hearing this, oh, that report is wrong, we're doing everything right. Yet we know that there are people working on the ground, and I mean, folks that are in law enforcement, folks that, work in different areas, that have a very different understanding and view of what's going on than the folks in leadership at the chief's level or at the DA's level. And that's what I'm most interested in hearing about. Like, even in that story, there was a very brave survivor that spoke about her specific case, and that she never dropped out of the process. And yet she, her case didn't move forward. And so, in the face of that, when you have a story right in front of you from a survivor and she tells you that wasn't true, and to still kind of go back and say, oh, no, it's not us, we're doing everything right, there's nothing to see here, folks, it's really insulting. And I hope that, we get some justice just around the accountability needed to address kind of the deeper issue. It would start with just a major culture shift in how we're listening to and addressing the needs of survivors.
Yeah, there's a lot of important stuff there. You're listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 in Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 in New Orleans. We are also available as a podcast on Spotify, SoundCloud, Spreaker, iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever podcasts are podded. We are talking with Amanda Lewis, who's a social worker and community organizer with the Survivor Justice Project, about the ongoing kind of scandal around rape clearance with the Austin Police Department and what real justice for these survivors might look like. Again, this has kind of been a national scandal, but in many ways, I think it's revealed the depth to which systemic change really needs to be brought about, all at once and all encompassing in many ways. So I'd like to turn to kind of the response of organizers to this and the response of people in the community to this in terms of what we can do to achieve some sort of justice when it seems that Austin police are obstructing justice along every turn. So, if we can talk about that, if we can talk about how the Survivor Justice Project has been responding to this, how other community organizers have been moving forward, and what sort of real justice would look like. How would we change this paradigm?
Yeah, thank you for asking. And I think it really starts with real transparency, right? So taking a look, as I mentioned before, bringing in some, professional investigators that can really do a deep dive into what's been going on, from not just with investigation, but from report to disposition, prosecution of, what is not working, what are we seeing, what are the issues, what are the gaps, and particularly with the investigations, doing a deep dive, maybe going as far back as 2011, and really, checking to see what case notes are saying, following up with survivors, really being able to build trust and a foundation of good information. So, that's the transparency that is needed to start. And I feel like a lot of the talk right now from APD, from the chief, has been that, we've been transparent. And that's not actually, I don't think that's accurate. I think what has happened over the last few years is a lot of activists and organizers and survivors have been very vocal and have been pushing for these changes, right? So survivors, showing up to City Hall to get, the right amount of victim service folks to help support them through their case, or, getting backlog money. That was all done because the community decided that we wanted to hold them accountable. And so, I think that right now what we're looking for is a commitment to digging deeper, really looking at the facts, and then a real comprehensive and collaborative path forward that involves the different community partners. So with Survivor Justice Project, of course, we work with all different types of groups and folks, and we've really had a lot of success working with the Sexual Assault Resource and Response Team, which is a group of organizations that support survivors in the immediate aftermath of sexual violence, and they have the kind of technical expertise to really help address issues. And so what we want is that deep dive with investigations to then lead into a path forward that includes survivors and is survivor centered. And I think that we're at the moment, because of all this media and engagement, to make that happen. So one thing that we'll see coming up, and if you want to check SJP's Facebook page, we're putting together a campaign with other organizers and organizations. And one of our first actions, so I'm not sure if it's well known, but there is a lawsuit. Plaintiffs are suing APD and the DA's office, and I think the sheriff's department isn't a part of it anymore. But basically, their suit is about, the fact that there were 1,000 reported sexual assaults and only one was prosecuted. And there's this proof, or there's this the 8 plaintiffs in their own cases are kind of representing that system failure that we've been talking about these last few years. And so we're going to go to their court. We're going to have a court watch for Monday the 17th. And we'll put information on our Facebook page if folks are interested in supporting the survivors in that way. We'll also look to help or get city leaders to really put down some real actionable steps to getting towards that collaborative solution. So there'll be an opportunity to go to a council meeting in the next few weeks, probably the last 2 weeks of January, and support resolutions around this issue. And so we've been really lucky. We have great support from other organizations. I want to say, like, Austin Justice Coalition has been very supportive, and they spoke out at the APD contract meeting about this issue. And so we're looking forward to joining with others on this, because this is really about all of us. And so we want to make sure, if there's a way that folks' voice can be heard, because I think that this is a really, really important piece of the issues around criminal justice reform. That other side of, we want police to be doing the right things. We want our city leaders to be focused in the right areas. And I think with this is kind of a prime example, is if you're hyper vigilant in other areas, you're abandoning really, really important issues like sexual violence. And so we want there to be a conscious effort and a focused effort on actually thoroughly investigating and prosecuting sexual assaults in Austin.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that this is such a vital issue for people to be following. We have seen in the past year, we've seen kind of major changes in the way civilian oversight over the police functions here in Austin. We've also seen kind of the reversal of that in other cities like Seattle, where they just lost, I believe, major civilian oversight of the police. The city council completely downgraded essentially the civilian oversight over the police department in Seattle. But in Austin, we've had kind of the opposite trend, where we just passed for the first time the Office of Police Oversight will be going into effect soon. And the Office of Police Oversight will be the first time in Austin's history where we have essentially a police oversight body that is completely independent of the police force itself. So before the Office of the Police Monitor was very hindered in their way of what they were able to do, what they were able to see, what records they were able to process and when, and what they were able to kind of tell of these different kind of cases of police accountability. So how do you feel that has affected your work, or how do you foresee that the Office of Police Oversight will kind of affect the work that Survivor Justice Project does?
I think that it'll be an important resource for us. We're excited to see how this new office functions. I think that, it's new to us, but we're excited, and we think this is a big piece of what we're looking for when it comes to transparency and actual accountability. So we're really excited, and I think we're also hopeful that we can form some more long-term eyes on the issues of sexual assault in Austin. And one of the things that we've been seeing, I think, so the new police monitor is going to be a key part, but also the city council restarting their public safety meetings that they used to have a few years ago. That was an opportunity for folks to bring issues to them. Looking at partnering with the Public Safety Commission I also sit on the Commission for Women. So bringing in more folks that are understanding the issue and getting folks up to speed is a big deal. I think one of the issues with sexual assault is it almost feels like you need some kind of like degree to like understand all the different, the DNA lab and all. You need to be a scientist. There's so many different pieces and there's so much depth here. So we look forward to helping get people up to speed and getting on the same page about it. So they know what to do. And also, how do we help survivors through this? How do we support our friends and family that are hearing about this news and it's really triggering? So we look forward to bringing more folks in that are paying attention and are wanting to find a way to support survivors. That's very exciting.
So we have a couple minutes left for those people who might be interested. Can you give people a way to kind of connect with the Survivor Justice Project? How would they either reach out to you and stay informed of the work it is you're doing, or how would they otherwise get involved, whether they're here in Austin, whether they're listening in New Orleans, or whether they're listening online to our podcast? How can people kind of get involved and stay in touch with the Survivor Justice Project?
Yeah, I think the first step is look us up at Survivor Justice Project on our Facebook page. And you can also email us at Survivor Justice Project at Gmail. And, I think as time goes, we'll have a couple of actions posted. As I mentioned, we're working on a campaign with some other activists and advocates. So that's coming out soon. Just stay tuned to our Facebook page. And if you have questions, if you have thoughts, we'd be happy to listen and support or share with our other community partners.
Yeah, thank you very much. We've been talking with Amanda Lewis. She's a social worker and community organizer with the Survivor Justice Project about the ongoing scandals around Austin Police Department. It's what appears to be a very misleading rape clearance rate that was nearly twice the national average. When the kind of surface was scratched on that, as we have just been talking about, it was revealed largely that APD has been fudging their numbers, and that many of these up to 1,400 cases have been allegedly miscategorized as having been exceptionally cleared, when in fact no arrest was made, no prosecution was made. So yeah, once again, we've been talking with Amanda Lewis. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
You are listening to People's Republic. People's Republic originates on KOOP in Austin, Texas. It's KOOP 91.7 in Austin, Texas. We also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 in New Orleans and are available as a podcast on Spotify, SoundCloud, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever else podcasts are podded. Stay tuned. We turn now to the continued economic war the U.S. is waging in Latin America against left-wing governments. I want to cover two governments in particular. President Maduro of Venezuela has once again decried the U.S. attempts to destabilize the Venezuelan government, which now, according to some reports, seems to include the U.S. training of Colombian paramilitaries on the Venezuelan border. Nonetheless, Venezuelan elections went off without any major issue, with Maduro's PSUV making gains in key opposition strongholds. In the U.S., Congress has unanimously passed devastating sanctions against the government of Nicaragua. The Nicaraguan Investment and Conditionality Act, the NICA Act, comes on the heels of a violent right-wing coup attempt earlier this year, backed by the U.S., and puts the power of mediation in the hands of the Catholic Church of Nicaragua, which has long supported right-wing forces. And just this October, leaked audio revealed the Catholic Church's auxiliary bishop of Managua, Silvio Baez, conspiring with the opposition to oust Nicaragua's elected president, Daniel Ortega. To talk about all this and more, we are joined again by Dan Kovalik. He's a human rights and labor lawyer, as well as the author of The Plot to Control the World and other books. Thank you, Dan, for coming on the show once again.
Thank you, Brian.
So let's start with the Venezuelan elections that recently happened. Is there anything kind of surprising there? It seems like the PSUV did very well, given kind of the division of the opposition within the country.
Yeah, there's nothing particularly surprising. As you say, the PSUV did do very well in these elections. They were municipal elections throughout the country. There was quite a bit of abstention. I think about, if I am correct, about 27% of the eligible electorate voted, which is small. Not terribly small when compared to U.S. midterm type elections. And again, this was only these were only local elections, so there were no even elections for National Assembly or president. So, but things are difficult there, and so it's not surprising that there was a certain amount of abstention. But yeah, the PSUV certainly comes out very strongly after those elections.
Something I've just kind of noticed, having read more recently from Chavez's own life, from Hugo Chavez's own life, is sort of the kind of complex web of coalitions within these political parties that I don't think we see very much within the U.S. I don't think many Americans have a very strong understanding of how a political party operates when there's not this kind of rigid two-party system where both, for instance, in the U.S., the Democrats and the Republicans both function in many ways as sort of different appendages of the state. So yeah, maybe we can talk about what the different kind of political alignments are within Venezuela very briefly, so people can understand the context for not only the PSUV but the various opposition parties that have both some have boycotted and some chose to participate, as they did in the presidential elections earlier this year.
First, as you say, you have the PSUV, which is the governing party. It has been the governing party of Venezuela for some time now. It is a broad coalition of, left of center to left wing groups and parties, which include, for example, the Communist Party of Venezuela. And it is, a party that, supports really the more disadvantaged sectors of the society: workers, peasants, Afro-Venezuelans, who are often forgotten in this discussion, indigenous Venezuelans. And so that is really the PSUV, and that is the groups I mentioned is where the PSUV gets its strongest support from. And then you used to have, at least for a time, a united opposition party in what was called the MOOD, which ran Henri Capriles for president in 2013, for example. But that opposition has broken up quite a bit. The reason for that is that the opposition is in quite a bit of disarray. As you said, it is really delegitimized itself. In large part, is Steve Elner, who I just heard speak, has said very well. It's largely a disloyal opposition, that it is an opposition that does not recognize the legitimacy of the government of Venezuela. It is an opposition that represents, for the most part, the wealthier sectors of Venezuela, and that is happy to trash the economy and to really undermine Venezuela and the health of Venezuela in order to try to take power. And they have shown themselves to be a disloyal opposition by supporting violent protests. And they don't have much support. And for the large part, they abstain from elections because they know they can't win. So that's kind of where we're at. The other thing with the opposition in Venezuela is that they've, worked hand in glove with the United States and have been very open about wanting regime change. And we have to remember that, sectors of this opposition successfully pulled off a coup in 2002 against Hugo Chavez. A coup in which he was kidnapped. He was sent to an island. Right afterwards, those who led the coup scrapped the Constitution, disbanded this National Assembly, disbanded the Supreme Court, Luckily, the coup was short-lived because the poor of Venezuela rallied to have Chavez return. But this is the nature of that opposition. It is not a democratic opposition, despite what we're led to believe by the mainstream press.
The opposition now, in many ways, can trace its roots then to that coup that overthrew the government in the early 2000s, and that's really to understand that those are the same people. It's not, for instance, people who are necessarily ex-Chavistas, or by and large, I would say it's not ex-Chavistas who were disillusioned with the revolution. These are people who never really supported a kind of left-wing revolution in the first place, and would return would prefer that kind of return to the older order of Venezuela, essentially being a client state for the U.S.
That's true. I mean, there are certainly many Chavistas in Venezuela who are not big supporters of Maduro, but they don't support the opposition. Those people largely would abstain from voting. They certainly will not cast their vote for the opposition, again, because the opposition does not represent their interest and does not represent the interests of a sovereign, independent Venezuela. And again, if there was any confusion about that, that confusion has been dispelled by the opposition's conduct over the past several years.
So one of the things that Maduro has asserted is, that's, and I think that this should be pretty obvious at this point, given those who are watching John Bolton's actions and rhetoric within the region. His call, I believe, is the troika of tyranny of Venezuela, Nicaragua, and I believe Cuba, and the kind of open U.S. support for the overthrow of the governments of these countries. But one of the things among the other kind of various attempts to destabilize Venezuelan government, including the assassination attempt at President Maduro, the attempted drone strike assassination that happened earlier this year. But there was also, Maduro has asserted that the U.S. is possibly training, I believe it was over 700 Colombian paramilitaries on the kind of border of Colombia and Venezuela. Is there any, is there any sort of historical context that might suggest that to be the case, that there are indeed that, given the kind of right-wing government of Duque in Colombia, that might be the case between Colombia and Brazil, that we might see that destabilization coming from those two countries in the next couple of years?
Well, yeah, and again, the national security advisor of Trump, John Bolton, has made it clear that that's going to happen. He's made it clear that the U.S. will partner with Colombia and Brazil to try to overthrow the Venezuelan government. We also have to remember the paramilitaries in Colombia are a creation of the United States. They're a brainchild of General William Yarborough, who in 1962 went to Colombia and hatched the idea for these paramilitary groups. And the U.S. has been a supporter of the paramilitaries, both directly and indirectly, since that time. It is, something, again, not discussed much in the mainstream media, but it is a reality. In fact, it was once in a while, as Chomsky points out, once in a while, if you read between the lines of the mainstream press, you'll see these realities, come to the fore. So, for example, there was an interesting, I think it was in the Washington Post a few years ago, a story about the CIA helping the Uribe administration with targeting the left-wing FARC guerrillas for attacks and providing them with smart bombs to carry out these attacks. Meanwhile, even though the paramilitaries were officially designated a terrorist organization by the United States, the Washington Post pointed out that the CIA and Colombian government left the paramilitaries largely alone during this time. And why? Because the paramilitaries are the stalking horse for the United States and the right wing in Colombia, and they are an essential part of U.S. policy in Colombia. So the idea that the CIA might be directly training paramilitaries to attack Venezuela is not out of the question, and frankly stands to reason.
Yeah, I think that would make a lot of sense. And for those of you who are just tuning in, you're listening to People's Republic. People's Republic with Brian Griffith originates out of Austin, Texas on KOLP 91.7 FM and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM. We are also available as a podcast on SoundCloud, Spotify, Spreaker, iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever podcasts are podded. We are talking with Dan Kovalik about the kind of updates to the U.S. economic and sometimes paramilitary warfare against the left-wing governments of Latin America. So I'd like to shift a little bit now to Nicaragua, where the U.S. Congress just passed unanimously the NICA Act. That's the Nicaragua Investment and Conditionality Act that, from everything I'm reading, is going to signal devastating sanctions. It's a sort of Kissinger-esque operation to what Kissinger would have called, or I guess what he probably still would call, I can't believe he's still alive. But what Kissinger has called, we're going to make the economy scream. And so that it's that same style of economic warfare of when when the Nicaraguan people, by and large, rejected the right-wing coup attempt against the Sandinistas earlier this year. This seems to be kind of the fallout of that, of now attempting to make economic conditions even more dire in order to foment more opposition to the Ortega government. So what kind of have you read about the NICA Act, and what effect are those sanctions likely to have?
So first of all, we got to keep in mind that the NICA Act has been in the hopper for a long time now, over a year. The House passed it some time ago, and it just passed in the Senate. But the point being, the House passed it well before the crisis over the summer. And so while people are trying to link the NICA Act to what happened over the summer, in fact, it's been very much debated even before that crisis. And moreover, what's very important to understand is that the opposition in Nicaragua pushed for the NICA Act, including the MRS, the Sandinista renovation movement, which many in the U.S. have confused as some sort of left-wing opposition to the Sandinistas. They've openly been lobbying for the NICA Act again, even before the crisis this summer. And this is very revealing, because what the NICA Act does is cut Nicaragua off from all international financing, from the IMF, from the World Bank. This financing has been used by the Sandinista government to fight poverty, which they've been very effective at. It's been used for social programs for the poor, which again have been very effective. This will make the poor in Nicaragua suffer. And again, any party in Colombia or in Nicaragua that would lobby for this, would lobby for a bill to make their own people suffer, really shows what this opposition is about. And there will be suffering that Nicaragua will suffer as a result of this.
I think it's interesting. I did not kind of realize that this bill was kind of in motion before the kind of turbulence within Nicaragua, because to me this seemed like that. Having seen it just sort of pop up now, I had sort of assumed that was the kind of pretense that the U.S. Congress was using the turbulence in Nicaragua over this past summer as sort of the pretense to launch the NICA Act, but now realizing that this was actually in motion kind of long beforehand. And in fact, it seems that they may have kind of preempted themselves there by attempting to launch this coup in what were relatively favorable economic conditions for the Nicaraguans, may have, kind of, I guess, speaks volumes to how much the U.S. has been chomping at the bit to get at these the the remaining left-wing governments of Latin America. For those who may not have the kind of context of other sanctions within the how the U.S. imposes the sanctions regime. I mean, for instance, the U.S. is currently banning in various ways through sanctions the import of, for instance, insulin, among other necessary medicines, to Venezuela. This is not something that is going to hurt the Chavista government. It's not going to it's not really going to hurt government officials. It's designed to target the people, and by and large, it targets the people for not, for continuing to support these left wing governments. I guess, how close are the Nicaraguan sanctions that are about to go into effect? How close are they to what we've seen in Venezuela in terms of their scope and what we can see as kind of the intended effects?
Well, I think these are at least as devastating, if not more, than what we've seen in Venezuela. Again, this is a real strike at the heart of Nicaragua's ability to survive. First of all, we have to, let's talk a little bit about Nicaragua. Nicaragua is one of the most intervened countries by the United States in the Western Hemisphere, second only to Haiti. And consequently, it also has been for a long time, well before the Sandinista Revolution, the second poorest country in the hemisphere. It continues to be the second poorest country. But meanwhile, we have to remember that once Ortega was reelected in 2006, and then he took office in 2007, he's done a lot to try to bring prosperity to Nicaragua. When he took over after 17 years of neoliberal rule in Nicaragua, only 15% of the country was electrified. That's 15%. Now nearly all the country's been electrified. They also have Wi-Fi throughout the country. Ortega's reduced poverty by nearly 40%. And since he was reelected, the economy has grown by 4 to 5% every year. So the Sandinistas have been very successful in trying to build a new Nicaragua, despite the U.S.'s eternal opposition to them. And they have used money, international financing, to do some of that work. That the U.S. would then cut off this financing at a very critical time. Already Nicaragua was reeling from these the attempted coup over the summer, which also targeted the economy, which really tanked the economy. And then to add this to Nicaragua's woes is really cruel. It will make it very difficult for Nicaragua to progress very much. Even with that said, Ortega has announced a number of different programs for next year, including increased investment in the social security system. So they're going to do their best to overcome this, but it will be very difficult. And the whole point is to put pressure on the Nicaraguan people to overthrow Ortega. And let me make it clear, I teach international law at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, and I can tell you these sanctions are illegal. These sanctions, unilateral sanctions like this, are really an act of war, and they are not allowed to be imposed under the UN Charter except through the Security Council, which the U.S. has not even attempted to do. And people need to keep that in mind when they think about these sanctions. But in any case, this will cause a lot of misery, again, mostly for the poorest of the poor in Nicaragua.
That's something I think we need to keep kind of reminding people, is that the kind of illegal nature, completely illegal nature of these sanctions that we just assume are this kind of natural outgrowth. Is there any kind of situation in which sanctions like this would be either justified either legally or morally? Is there such a thing as like an actual humanitarian sanction?
Well, I don't believe so. I don't believe there is such a thing. There is legally, again, you could go to the Security Council and in certain circumstances and get the Security Council to approve economic sanctions in certain cases in order to maintain international peace and security. Certainly sanctions targeted at the military would be legitimate. That comes to mind. But these types of sanctions, which are aimed at the population, I can't see any legal or moral justification for ever.
The Nicaraguan Sandinista movement in many ways has been kind of, I would say, democratic socialist or social democratic revolution. It's been one that does not consider itself kind of openly communist. It's really on the grand scale of things, it's not that far to the left. It's simply, acting within the framework of sort of I guess I would call it a kind of bourgeois nationalism of let's sort of improve things for our own people. Let's build up a kind of a quote unquote welfare state, and let's generally kind of reduce the devastating poverty and oppression of the country to a more to something more bearable. I think in many ways, it's kind of struggled with that contradiction, as do other kind of left-wing alliances. And I think that's in many ways why we saw the Sandinistas lose the elections in 1990 when Daniel Ortega stepped down. Not because of that, but in fact, because the U.S. had been so kind of destructive toward the country for having the audacity to keep the Sandinistas in power. But as we saw with the kind of neoliberal creep after that, these devastating conditions of poverty create the conditions where these left-wing governments are needed. And they also kind of create the conditions, I think, where the people then become more aware of sort of what works for them, what doesn't work for them. The more they're sort of besieged, or the more then kind of defense they feel of that, whatever the revolution might be. So how do you feel the conditions are in Nicaragua? Do you feel that people might actually give up the kind of Sandinista project? Do you feel that the Sandinistas might actually, start losing popularity, or are people in Nicaragua going to see this as another U.S. attack, and then will that essentially entrench the kind of Sandinista movement further?
Well, I think for now they definitely see this as a foreign attack against the country and are rallying around the Sandinistas. Absolutely. However, if there's enough suffering, people might, make a different decision. We have to remember, actually, in 1990, the Sandinistas were voted out of power after, a decade of the U.S. supporting a war against that country in the form of the Contra War, which claimed the lives of about 30,000 Nicaraguans and which destroyed their economy. And finally, the Nicaraguans cried uncle, in this case, Uncle Sam, and they voted the Sandinistas out. So if, enough suffering is imposed, certainly people might make a different decision to end that suffering. But at the moment, people have decided that the Sandinistas have their interest at heart and are rallying around them.
So it looks like we have a couple minutes left to just sort of, wrap up. I'd like to once again mention, for what this is worth, that this October, the leaked audio was revealed, essentially showing that the Catholic Church's auxiliary bishop in Managua, Silvio Baez, had conspired with the Nicaraguan right-wing opposition to oust Nicaragua's elected president, Daniel Ortega, and that this is the body that, according to the NICA Act, that was just unanimously passed by Congress, these devastating sanctions, this is the body, the Catholic Church, that conspired with the opposition. It's kind of discussing that this is the body that is supposed to be mediating, I think, the kind of talks between the opposition and the Ortega government is just an absolutely right-wing conspirator in many ways. So you have any last thoughts on that, or anything else we might not have mentioned so far?
Well, we have to remember the Catholic hierarchy in Nicaragua, and I distinguish that from some of the base communities in Nicaragua, some of which are liberation theologians and they're progressive. But the hierarchy itself of the Catholic Church has always been opposed to the Sandinistas. But moreover, as I understand, the biggest loser from the crisis has been the Catholic Church, because they did expose themselves as supporters of the coup. And while they claimed to have been the mediators between the opposition and the government, in fact, they exposed themselves on national TV as obstructing those discussions. And so the church hierarchy has really lost a lot of support in Nicaragua, has really exposed themselves for the disloyal opposition they are. And yeah, it makes total sense the U.S. will be aligning with that hierarchy, but at the moment, they don't have a lot of sway over the population.
I think we're gonna go ahead and leave it there. Yes, a lot of interesting thoughts there, and we want to keep covering these two, both these two kind of moments in Venezuela and Nicaragua, understanding these in the context of the economic warfare that the U.S. is waging against left-wing governments. This kind of resurgence of all the Bush era neocons like John Bolton, and even the resurgence of neoconservative language such as the troika of tyranny. Really gives the U.S. game away as far as what the U.S. is planning in terms of a regime change and destabilization in Latin America. So we can, continue to hope for the best and continue above all, whatever reservations people might have about various left-wing governments, understanding, of course, that these sanctions remain illegal under international law. They're immoral. They are designed to punish the people, and that these countries have a right to sovereignty. They have a right to make their own decisions. If there are contradictions within the governments of these countries, if there are corruption issues, those are things that deserve to be handled within the country by the people and not by U.S. Sanctions and regime change operations. So I'd like to go ahead and leave it there. We've been talking with Dan Kovalik, who's a human rights and labor lawyer, as well as the author of The Plot to Control the World. Thank you very much, Dan, for coming on once again.
Thank you, Brian.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic. Or you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. Thank you for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.